Good evening. Thank you for joining us. This is session 2 of our lecture series on Theodore Roosevelt with Edward Dodson.
Thank you, Ibrahima. And welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this second episode of Theodore Roosevelt's story. As I asked last week for a volunteer, our friend Marty Rowland was kind enough to step forward and volunteer to take the role of Theodore Roosevelt. I know I can count on Marty again, I'm sure. Is there anyone else who would be interested in taking on that role for this evening? Well, Marty, looks like if you're up to it, I would love to have you be Theodore Roosevelt for the night. Are you okay with that?
Yeah. So I finally got in.
All right.
I can do that.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so last week we left off with Roosevelt really just beginning to be recognized as a national figure. And of course, he would eventually become vice president of the United States and become president because of the assassination of the president. So if you remember last week, here's what his comment was about the vice presidency. And it will, I'll let Marty read that again just to set the tone here for his attitude about serving in public office.
The presidency being all important and the vice presidency being vice presidency of comparatively little note, the entire strength of the contending factions is spent in the conflict over the first. And very often a man who is most anxious to take the first place will not take the second, preferring some other political position. It has thus frequently happened that the two candidates have been totally dissimilar in character and even in party principle, though both running on the same ticket. Very odd results have followed in more than one instance.
Yeah, and those of you who are students of U.S. history will remember that at the beginning of the nation's political life, the president, people ran for president and vice president separately, and there were real problems because John Adams elected as vice president to George Washington, and then all sorts of conflict before they finally fixed it to this extent that the vice president and president ran on the same ticket together. So early on, they really didn't know, exactly how this would work out, but the experience suggested that there some reform was needed. And over the course of many presidencies, there were many cases where the vice president became more and more important, and so had to take on more than the simple role of being in the wings in case needed to step into the presidency. Well, with regard to our friend Theodore Roosevelt, he was back from Cuba. His regiment came back in August, and Roosevelt was decommissioned. Republican leaders then approached him to run in the election for the next governor of the state of New York. And as revealed by a short passage in his autobiography, his political views, his principles left him almost no room for tolerance for extremism. He was someone who believed, that centrist politics was in fact the norm. And this quotation tells you a bit about where he thought the country was at the time. Go ahead, Marty. Marty, you might as well leave yourself unmuted because there's quite a few quotations to read. We can't hear you now. You're still muted. Well, maybe there you go.
Oh, there we go. There we go. There is a lunatic fringe to every reform movement. At least 9/10 of all the sincere reformers supported me, but the ultra pacifists, the so-called anti-imperialists or anti-militarists or peace at any price men preferred my opponent to me.
Yeah, and certainly within the single tax movement, there was a good deal of split feelings about Roosevelt as someone to support, at least at this stage. And we'll get on to the discussion of what actually happened. He had also something of importance to say in response to reformers who expressed a lot of concern over the extremes of wealth and poverty existing in the country. In a January 1897 issue of the Review of Reviews, Roosevelt responded to concerns raised in a letter he received from the Populist Party vice presidential candidate. His name was Thomas E. Watson. And in that Review of Reviews, here's what Watson wrote. He said, I think the men who run a bank, a factory, a railroad, or a foundry should make all the profit in business he fairly can. But I do believe that banks should not exercise the sovereign power of issuing money. And I do believe that all special privileges granted and all exemption from taxation work infinite harm. I do believe that the wealth of the Republic is practically free from federal taxation, and that the burdens of government fall upon the shoulders of those least able to bear them. And so here's the beginning of the progressive reforms that are going to be advocated in the United States to try to deal with a lot of these issues. The railroad monopoly, the banking monopoly, the problems of under taxation of wealth, estates, all of that. And what does Roosevelt have to say about it? Well, his response conveyed his faith in the American system as offering the best outcomes that could be expected. Maybe not perfection, but the best outcomes that could be expected. So Marty, I have 4 slides now coming from Roosevelt's responses that are pretty important, which is why I quoted him at some length here.
Well, that's good.
So here you go.
There are plenty of ugly things about wealth and its possessors in the present age, and I suppose there have been in all ages. But on the whole, the thrifty are apt to be better citizens than the thriftless, and the worst capitalists cannot harm laboring men as they are harmed by demagogues.
Sets the stage, very defensive of the capitalist system, and the outcomes, while they might not be perfect, still create the opportunity for more people than any other system that's been devised up to that point. And he goes on.
As the people of a state grow more and more intelligent, the state itself may be able to play a larger and larger part in the life of the community, while at the same time individual effort may be given freer and less restricted movement along certain lines. But it is utterly unsafe to give the state more than the minimum of power just so long as it contains masses of men who can be moved by the pleas and denunciations of the average socialist leader of today.
Any comments in response to what Roosevelt has told us here? Well, let me ask you a question. What is it that is always talked about in the United States as the key to individual success? What is it that's stressed more than anything else?
Bootstraps.
And bringing yourself up by your bootstraps involves what? Education. In the United States, I mean, we hear it all the time for any, minorities, immigrants, those who grow up in poverty, get an education. And for many of us, many generations of Americans, that has been, in fact, the case. But it's not been universal in success for all sorts of reasons. Some people have not been able to make it along that path to follow formal education into a successful economic experience in life. So he adds more.
There may be better schemes of taxation than those at present employed. It may be wise to devise inheritance taxes and to impose regulations of the kinds of business which can be carried on only under the special protection of the state. And where there is a real abuse by wealth, it needs to be, and in this country generally has been promptly done away with.
Well, he reaches a conclusion. I suspect that many reformers at the time would have a great disagreement with the conclusion that these have been promptly done away with. But what about inheritance taxes? It's kind of interesting that he suggests that maybe inheritance taxes or wealth taxes would be an appropriate approach to evening the playing field a bit. So that, I mean, we're still having that debate on what level of estates should be subject to taxation, and should that taxation be progressive? Should it be a flat tax? We haven't yet even figured that out. So he's raising a lot of important questions, and he has his own opinions. Will those opinions change? Well, we're going to find out. And finally, here's the final part of this quote.
But the first lesson to teach the poor man is that, as a whole, the wealth in the community is distinctly beneficial to him, that he is better off in the long run because other men are well off, and that the surest way to destroy what measure of prosperity he may have is to paralyze industry and the well-being of those men who have achieved success.
Yeah, I mean, all of that certainly makes sense from our experience. I mean, some of us are able to find a way to be self-employed and be successful, and many of us don't have that creativity, and so we find ourselves employed working for others and for other companies, corporations, or whatever. So there's all that complexity, and Roosevelt realizes that, but he's telling us that the larger the pie, the wealth of the pie, the more likely it is that we'll get a greater share of it. Again, is it universally true? No, but in his own time, he's recognizing and acknowledging the growth of the middle class. That one of the unique things about the United States, even in 1897, 1900, is that there is a growing middle class. So he's now elected to govern. And it's in the governor's office that he begins to really study economic issues, and in particular, the harm that's done by trusts, other monopolies, and their alliances with entrenched political bosses. So, Roosevelt is really troubled by political corruption and by the machine, politics that exists in the cities and their connections with the states. And so all of that comes together with this idea that there's an undue amount of power concentrated politically that in fact has a negative impact on economic outcomes for people. And so reform of the government and getting government to properly represent the interests of the public good is something that Roosevelt feels very committed to. He later reflected on his approach to getting things accomplished once he was in office. And here's what he says.
I always did my best in good faith to get heads of the machine to accept my views and to convince them by repeated private conversations that I was right. I never wantonly antagonized or humiliated them. I did not wish to humiliate them or to seem victorious over them. What I wished was to secure the things that I thought it essential to the men and women of the state to secure.
Power of persuasion, that even people who are, enjoying unnecessary power might come to reason and understand that it is in the long-term interests of the people and even themselves to relinquish some of that control. So it sounds as though he's a practical politician and he's looking for the right outcomes. And he knows that, at least his view is, that attacking his opponents or attacking members of his own party isn't the way to get that accomplished. His political smarts as a governor was described by the historian Robert Wesser. And here's what Wesser has to say about Theodore there. Though Roosevelt certainly felt uncomfortable about a system which was antithetical to his reformist inclinations, he could and did play the game well enough to succeed without sacrificing principle or perspective. His years as governor give ample proof of his ability to exercise strong, forward-looking leadership and yet maintain a working relationship with a group of ultra-conservative, oft-times irresponsible party leaders. I'm just sitting here in silence thinking about our political situation today. And I'm sure behind closed doors, there's a lot of those kinds of discussions going on, trying to get those who are uncompromising to compromise, those who are unthinking to think. Well, his administration, however, introduced only a very few pieces of reform legislation. New York reformers actually felt betrayed by his failure to take on the New York City political machine. An early major fight occurred with the political, powerful U.S. Senator from New York, who's named Thomas Platt, over the reapportionment of key state officials. So, he didn't get everything he wanted, and there were some powerful opponents. Yet some insight into his values was revealed in a June 1900 issue of the Century magazine. And in that, he expressed his contempt for, with slightly disordered mentalities who champion reforms as a kind of tribute to their own righteousness. On occasion, it might be necessary to cut loose and stand alone for a great cause, but the necessity for such action is almost as rare as the necessity for revolution. Sometimes it is a sign of the highest statesmanship to temporize. I should have had Marty read that. Sorry, Marty.
Oh, no problem.
But anyway, you can see, he's looking, he has principles, he has a desire for practical achievement, and he knows that he has to go fairly far along the line, even close to sacrificing his principles in order to get those outcomes that he's looking for. But he tries, at least up to this point, not to antagonize people if at all possible. Once he's in office, he sought to reform the state's civil service law. That was one of his important reforms. This photograph has nothing to do with that, but I thought it was very interesting, of the early above ground trolley system or whatever it was. Maybe someone who knows New York history can tell me what this was all about. But anyway, I thought it was an interesting photo from that period. So he calls for an increased inspection of factories, for stricter enforcement of labor laws, and then he took on the taxation of public service corporations that enjoyed perpetual franchises. So for those of you who are familiar with the history of the single tax movement, this was an initiative that was very much at the forefront of single tax reform activity, particularly as it was occurring in Ohio under Mayor Tom L. Johnson, who was a right-hand supporter of Henry George and who was trying to get legislation passed during his tenure as mayor to bring the public service transportation systems into the public sector, or if not, to at least get the fares reduced and limit the value of the franchises that private companies were enjoying. So here, Theodore Roosevelt is basically adopting a similar position to try to increase the taxation of these private corporations that have these perpetual monopoly franchises. And on that particular question, here's what he writes.
Okay, taxation, especially in New York City, was rapidly becoming more and more burdensome, and there appeared to be no sufficient reason for exempting valuable corporate franchises from paying their share of the public expenses.
No sufficient reason other than political influence and maybe their willingness to make significant contributions to the political campaigns of the people that were making the decisions about whether to tax the franchises or not. A New York senator, Senator Platt, made sure that Roosevelt's bill died in committee. Theodore then called for a special session of the legislature for the purpose of passing an amended statute, which they did, and the governor finally signed. The amended bill that Roosevelt had passed had two objectives, which he describes.
He believed that the value of the franchises could be assessed by a state board instead of by local authorities, and that provision should be made for crediting the corporations with any tax which they already paid under existing laws.
So what were the values? What was the market value of these franchises? Well, there's a secondary market for all these monopoly licenses. You can think of a long list of them, in any community. A liquor license. Think about the sale of a restaurant that has a liquor license versus the sale of a restaurant that does not. What is the difference in the value that a potential buyer is going to pay for? They're going to pay for that liquor license, which gives them a monopoly based on what the community allows. In certain communities, as you probably know, only one enterprise serving alcoholic beverages can exist on a block or on some particular geography. So remember, this is also the period of time when there's prohibition in the air. There are plenty of people who are arguing that one of the main reasons for social discord and for poverty is the uncontrolled consumption of alcoholic beverages, and so all of this is going on at the very same time that Theodore Roosevelt is rising within the public dialogue. So during the 1900 legislative year, Theodore obtained permission to appoint a commission to investigate the conditions of tenement housing in New York City. And this is a photograph from that era showing what it was like to live in these tenement houses. Hardly any fresh air, certainly no or few amenities at all. And so this was a real terrible housing condition for all of the people who are immigrants coming into the city. He saw to the creation of a state hospital to treat people who had developed tuberculosis, which was a really serious contagious disease at the time. And he established a policy of protecting the state's forests. So he begins to introduce his ideas about conservation of nature, and does so right there in New York State. Let me stop for just a second and ask if there are any comments or questions on what we covered so far.
Hi.
Hello, Joe.
This is a great presentation. The gentleman that you read who ran for another party, what he said about issuing money in banks, that was really quite the statement. What year would that have been?
What was his view?
No, what year would he have made that statement about the issuance of money by banks?
Well, this is somewhere between 1897 and 1901.
And is this kind of typical of the expertise that was being passed on by the
Well,
Greenback Party?
William Jennings Bryan is the prominent figure in this whole discourse because he was campaigning for president of the United States on the platform of adopting bimetallism. And so there's this constant debate over the money system and whether or not we should, as Brian said, should we be put on a cross of gold? He thought the country was unnecessarily burdened by the fact that there's not enough gold to go around. There's not a lot of gold in the West. The West has silver. So it's bimetallism. And then in 1873, there was a serious financial and economic crisis in the United States. Henry George wrote about that as well. But throughout this whole period, there is constant debate over the banking system, the issuance of money. Should there be national banks? Should there only be state banks? And if you have state chartered banks, what sort of money should they be allowed to issue? What should it be backed by, if anything? And so it's all very complicated debate nationally and internationally as well over what constitutes money and what should be the responsibility of the government versus private banks in issuing money and controlling the supply of credit.
Thank you.
Does that answer your question?
It's a fascinating story and little known,
Well,
obviously.
I taught a whole course on this, and it's online. If you go onto my YouTube channel, and I think the school has it probably in its archives. I don't know how. Maybe Ibrahima can tell you how to access the course that I taught for the school. But I tried to trace this whole history, and the debate over what kind of financial system we ought to have. The debate that we're still having today, aren't we?
You wouldn't happen to remember the title of that course, would you?
The history of money and banking.
History of money and banking. Okay, thanks very much. I have to leave now to go to a volunteer event, but I hope the video is recorded and we get to see it. I can see the rest of it. In fact, I'll try to record it on my phone. You take care. Thanks so much.
I'm sure Ibrahim is recording this and it will be available.
Thanks so much.
Wayne, how are you?
Oh, fine. I basically have three comments. And one is Theodore Roosevelt was quite critical of the reformers who were anti-imperialists and all that. And I think he might well have been referring to William Jennings Bryan, who was a leading anti-imperialist at the time.
Of course.
Yes. And he also, there's mention of Tom Watson as a reformer, and name jumped out to me as a man who was a leading Southern racist demagogue. And I'm trying to somehow I read about him. I remember forget the details, but I might check into that. And the other is I was curious about Senator Platt. Is he the same Platt whose name is attached to the Platt Amendment, which allowed American intervention in Cuba as in exchange for Cuban intervention and Cuban independence?
I don't know, but that sounds logical that given the time frame that we're talking about.
Right. Yeah.
Not if there were two Senator Platts in the Congress at the same time.
Yeah. Right.
But your comment about Watson, these it's really interesting when you dig into the personalities of some of these individuals. They could be imperialist free traders. They could be absolute racists and be for school reform. It's amazing, you know, when you get down to the specifics of what their principles were, and how consistent that was with their the issues that they got behind when they were in some form of decision making in government. But I haven't researched his history, so I can't really say anything of value on for him or against him as an individual. But I just found that comment that he made that was relevant to the discussion of Roosevelt.
Yeah, in those days you could be a genuine progressive and also a virulent racist at the same time.
I mean, religion comes into this whole discussion, you know, depending upon, are you Protestant, Catholic, evangelical? Are you Jewish? Are you an atheist? You might be some of all of that in some sense. Marty.
Yeah, thanks. There was a reference to Huey P. Long, and I figured I'd make a comment about that. I gave a course on, and it's probably in the archives of the Henry George School. But I would I would disagree that Huey P. Long was a racist.
I don't think we mentioned Long. Did I mishear?
Well, no, he mentioned somebody from I don't know, Louisiana or something.
Tom Watson. Tom Watson.
I thought I heard Tom Watson and then a reference to somebody else. But maybe I'm wrong. But anyway, so Huey P. Long was from that era. He was assassinated in the 30s. But
he was later. He was later in the 1930s.
Yeah, but he was able to put together a coalition, and he gave African Americans a break, and he was able to not only get their vote, but he's also getting the racist vote too. So, but he was really against the oil companies, Standard Oil. So, anyway, so I thought I'd come to. Well, I wasn't coming to Huey P. Long's defense, but just thought I'd clarify that.
I will say this: I did read, and nothing I've read since has contradicted this. Is that Huey Long was the only Southern demagogue who did not exploit the race issue. All the others did.
Well, what I know of Long is he considered himself to be a populist.
Yeah,
and so his political life and career would be an interesting subject for someone to do some research and maybe do a presentation. You know, given that the time that he came to power and where he came to power, it would, I'm sure it would reveal some very interesting interaction between Huey Long and those who were still advocating the single tax and land value taxation based on their continued sentiment in favor of Henry George's ideas. Well, anyway, where we get on from here is now Roosevelt becoming part of the public that's invested in the United States expansion. So in its relationship with other peoples, the U.S. is now embarking on what a lot of people felt was the nation's manifest destiny, to spread the system of American democracy to other parts of the world. But certainly others, William Jennings Bryan being one, and many of the people associated with Lewis F. Post in the public were anti-imperialists, and they were very concerned about American expansionism outside of the continental United States. Well, what was the first step for the U.S. along this path? Well, that's 1898 with the annexation of the Hawaiian Islands. And the justification for that was in part concern over Japan, that the Japanese might in fact extend their empire, their imperialist empire, all the way to the Hawaiian Islands, which would give them a real strong potential position should there be a conflict with the United States. And then 2 years later, the Americans went further, closer to Japan, when we added the Philippines to our areas of concern and established a military presence there. So what's happening in the United States is very troubling to some. Others see it as part of our natural destiny, our manifest destiny, and it's being debated among the leading figures in the country and by the political parties. Here's a photograph of the Republican National Convention in 1900. And at the convention, Roosevelt is now drafted to become vice president in the second McKinley administration. And during the campaigning, he did his best to portray William Jennings Bryan and Bryanism as radical. And so, Bryan had a lot of support from what were called Democratic Democrats, those who were reform-minded within the Democratic Party, which of course had its own complexities because the southern states in the South were still voting Democrat, but there were few reform-minded people in the Democratic Party in the South. As the election of 1900 approached, Roosevelt provided his views on the U.S. presence in the Philippines, and it gives you a good sense of where he was going in terms of what he thought the appropriate role of the United States would be.
Under Spanish rule, the Filipinos were treated with intolerable cruelty. The Aguinaldian leaders have, wherever their power is extended, continued a system almost as bad. So far as I am aware, not one competent witness who has actually known the facts believes the Filipinos capable of self-government at present, or believes that such an effort would result in anything but a horrible confusion of tyranny and anarchy.
And I want to point you to, if you want to dig into this a little bit more deeper, to the issues of the public around this time, because Louis F. Post was engaged in correspondence with people who were in the Philippines, and they're reporting back quite a bit on everything that's going on. They had a unique ability to be present with all sides of the war that was going on there between the indigenous people, between the Spanish and the United States. And it's a very checkered period with regard to the U.S. military and its presence in the Philippines. Now, Roosevelt goes on as follows.
I do believe that if Bryan and his sympathizers cannot make their campaign without such acts and speech as are traitorous to the government in time of war, it would be more generous and noble to hold their opinions in abeyance until we can straighten out this tangle. If Bryan is defeated and the country gives the administration the right support, we can finish up this job without great loss of American life and without great punishment to the natives.
And in my mind, that sounds very consistent with how U.S. foreign policy analysts have argued the case for U.S. involvement wherever we've become involved. That we can finish up the job without great loss of American life and without great punishment to the natives. I'm sure all of you have reached your own conclusion about U.S. involvement in Southeast Asia, but that's only one example of where the U.S. took pains to argue that very case, where the results have been quite different. Well, William Jennings Bryan, for his part, in response to Roosevelt and his party, denounced the annexation of the Philippines as unconstitutional. And so in a speech delivered on the 10th of April in 1900, he defined the continued U.S. occupation of the Philippines as evidence that the U.S. had now become one more imperialist power. Bryan wrote, "There is a difference between expansion and imperialism. Expansion is the extension of the limits of a republic without a change of its character. Imperialism is the policy of an empire. We have expanded before. We never had imperialism before. We expanded when we took in Florida. We expanded when we took in the Louisiana Territory. We expanded when we took in Texas and New Mexico and California. But today it is not expansion. It is not taking in land that can be settled by American citizens and built up into American states. It is going across an ocean to get not land for settlement, but races for subjugation." And he finishes up with this. "Heretofore, we have extended the area of the Republic, and every citizen has enjoyed the protection of the flag and the Constitution. But the Republican Party now wants this nation to enter into a career of imperialism." Let me ask your reaction to what Bryan has had to say here. I have my own comments that I'll offer, but let me hear from those of you who might have your own reaction. Wayne?
Well, I was young. I was more inclined to favor Roosevelt, but now I really think that Bryan was right on this score, because once you become an empire, you more and more things become causes celeb for getting into other wars, because you need to protect the far-flung reaches of the empire, and it's and it eventually brings you into direct conflict with other powers.
Well, let me ask you, though, more specifically, what do you think about his argument that our expansion across the North American continent was not imperialistic?
Yeah, that's in a way it was, because you displaced the native peoples there. But I think his view was that was okay, but these could become American states, and they did. But he didn't see how we could kind of emerge in the Philippines as an American state, and they never were.
So there is a distinction with the difference. The question is the degree of difference.
Yes. Yeah.
Marty, I saw you had your hand up as well.
Yeah, I thought I'd make a comment. Yeah, there is a big difference, because there was never an intention to let the people of the Philippines to exercise any self-government. I think that an alternative that probably Bryan would have supported would be to provide military protection, or maybe ships in the port, so that if Japan wanted to challenge their presence there, they'd be there ready to prevent an expansion. But to do what Bryan was saying, it is really to extract wealth without any clear benefit to the people who are there. Yeah, it is kind of interesting that we take land that's contiguous, but at least the people in the continental United States became part of the system. That can be argued too, but I see the difference. But I think Bryan was correct in this.
the people of the tribal people that occupied, most of the West, depending on, you can define the West as everything within about 50 miles of the Atlantic Ocean at one point. This is what our history here in the United States has a lot of contradiction to it in terms of, the principles that we espoused versus the actions of the people in our leadership. We could condemn outside powers for their imperialism and then go ahead and practice the same actions and justify them on the basis that we're spreading democracy or it's our manifest destiny. Michael?
I think it's a very interesting thing you draw attention to, expansionism or imperialism. My first thought was expansionism, people want to come to you. People want to emigrate to your country and join with you in the conditions you've raised. But imperialism, you go to them to steal from them. And I think and the Roman Empire is an example of that. And perhaps the British Empire and many other empires. And empires always fall, they seem to fall. But expansionism, I don't know whether expansionism loses its effect. But expansionism is with people coming to your country is got its own set of problems with people. We have in England the people coming across from Europe and everything else, and it's a real problem that we can't handle too many, it seems, and we got so that has its problems as well.
Well, we have the difficulty in the United States, of course, of the thousands and thousands of people trying to escape despotism and economic hardship in Central and South America.
Yeah.
And you can, in some respect, you can empathize with the governors and mayors in a state like Texas that's receiving the overwhelming majority of these people, of putting them on a bus and sending them to New York City, to try to, we can say it's not a very moral thing to do, but at the same time, from a standpoint of practical politics, it is suggesting to people, this is a national problem. This is not a problem for the southern border. This is a national problem. And guess what? We're going to make it a problem for some of the people who otherwise would be unaffected by sending more immigrants to be cared for and provided for.
Everyone talks here about we welcome immigrants coming to our country, the Huguenots and all that, and they contributed and expanded the virtues of England, etc., and Britain, but it comes at a point where, I don't know, it's almost like a takeover. It becomes an imperialism from the other in itself. You're being demolished by the sheer weight of your expansion attracted them, and then you're being taken over, as it were, and that's when trouble seems to start. Anyway,
how are we going to share this planet? How do we figure out how
exactly
to live by the principle that the earth is the birthright of all persons equally? We divided it up into nation states, and within each nation state, we have established systems of private property under law that have largely resulted in a concentrated ownership of land and natural resources. And millions of people are deprived of any kind of opportunity to live a decent human life under those conditions. And yet the countries where they would like to go to are suffering from scarcity as well. So not a problem that has gone away. It's only accelerated. And in Roosevelt's time, in 1900, this was the period when historian Frederick Jackson Turner was announcing to his readership that the frontier was now closed. that the era of free land, where people could move to and establish their own
Homestead.
piece of the rock, their own, be self-sufficient, farming land and living that way, that was no longer possible because the land had been privatized, and now the game was very much different.
Yeah.
So this is the world that Theodore Roosevelt is now emerging into, and he's not particularly ready for it, but 6 months into McKinley's second term, he's assassinated while he's attending the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, New York. And so now Theodore Roosevelt is ascending to the presidency to reassure Republican leaders that he would adhere to the party platform. Roosevelt made this interesting decision. He retained McKinley's entire cabinet. And these are people who do not necessarily agree with Roosevelt on what the priorities of the government should be. And so we will leave it tonight at that point. And next week, we'll begin to talk about Theodore Roosevelt as president of the United States and all of the challenges that now face him with regard to his new responsibilities. So we have a little bit of time for Q&A, for some more questions and discussion. So what's on your mind? Let me hear you with any questions or comments you have about what we've talked about tonight.
Ed, I have a comment regarding the slide before this one, the slide by Jennings. You want to get back a little? Okay, yeah. So it sort of mirrors what you had in the French colonial lexicon, because their colonies, they had basically two types of colonies. They had colonies where they settled, like an entire chunk of French population was moved into those areas because the weather was good, very similar to what you had in French. So they moved an entire population. An example in Africa would be in Algeria.
Mm-hmm.
But you also have colonies where they had very few people. Basically, they had a governor, they had military bases, and they have tax collectors, and they had businesses for exploiting resources and then sending back to the metropolis. So the legal situation among those two are really different. In the first case, you have the extension of the republic. That's what I think Jennings calls expansion, because basically you just replicate domestic institutions to some extent, grant citizenship rights to some extent, and you encourage your local people to go there. But in the other case, basically, you are there after resources. And when it also comes to decolonization, I'm not very familiar with the English experience, but in the case of France, colonies where they settled their locals, it was much more difficult to pull out than in other colonies where they went just for the resources. So that's why the war in Algeria was really tough, because they even had a coup d'etat because some generals that were in Algeria didn't want de Gaulle to sign the Evian Accord that just declared Algeria independent. Okay.
Well, of course, what we know about the division of the African continent by the European powers was that it set the stage for conflict once the colonial powers relinquished their hold on those countries. Because, we see it now, the conflict between people of different tribal associations or, ancient ethnic identities, with trying to live within the borders established by an imperialist European power. And once that European power removed its police, and military presence, it leaves the opening for the emergence of conflict from the people who are left behind. It's not just Africa. Just think about the Balkans. Think what happened after Tito died and Yugoslavia was now faced with what kind of a future the people of quote Yugoslavia would have, and you have the Serbs and the Croats and the Muslim people remembering that they never could get along for 500 years. Ireland, another example, I mean, conquest of northern part of the Irish island by Protestant people of British, Scottish background, and we've had nothing but conflict over control of Ireland ever since. We could go on and name country after country today where there's still this kind of strife. I think what's so unusual about the American experience is that people from every part of the world came here expecting to be part of the American system to some degree, and we've tried to create a society unique in history where you have people from every diverse background you can think of trying to live together relatively peacefully under one system of law. Hasn't worked perfectly, and maybe that's what Roosevelt was feeling already in 1900, and reformers, single taxers among them, had ideas of how to make it work more perfectly. I hope I didn't interrupt you, Ibrahim. If you had any additional comments.
It's okay. Yeah, it's good. Thank you.
Anyone else have anything that you'd like to add to our conversation tonight?
Ed, this is Dylan.
Okay, Dylan, welcome.
What point were you making about Huey P. Long?
I wasn't making a point about Huey, but the conversation about Huey Long was that he was a populist in the South who did not use his populism for racial division purposes. And I can't really say a whole lot more about it than that because I just don't know.
Yeah, I did a lot of research on that. If you want me to explain a little bit more of that.
Yeah, go ahead, Marty.
Okay. Yeah, I was teaching a 7-part class on those idea of people being populists or demagogues and saints and demagogues. That's what it was. So Huey P. Long saw an opportunity to go after Standard Oil, and that's where a lot of his wealth came, was that he put high taxes on oil revenue, and he essentially became popular because he knew how much the masses, so to speak, needed to feel like they're better off. He had all sorts of campaigns for the little guy. I wouldn't say that he was a socialist or a communist, but he was just a practical politician who knew how to weigh and measure where his support's going to be. But was there any specific question about Huey P. Long?
No, Marty. So I'm actually from Louisiana, and
I lived there 28 years.
oh, sweet. So yeah, you know as well. I mean, the first things that come to mind about the way that we learned about him was, yeah, he was heavily reliant on making sure that infrastructure was built during that time, and most of our roadways, are still because of him.
The Huey P. Long Bridge, and
that and Highway 61 taking it all the way to New Orleans.
Yeah, he was famous for revenue bonds, where you would have a toll, and they do those in New York with the Triborough Bridge and all those, where you put out a bond and you pay it back with the revenue from the tolls, and that was a common way that they did things.
Do you have anything to say about his assassination?
No, other than, whoever did it probably was put up by somebody with national, it just sounds too fishy to be an accident like the Lee Harvey Oswald kind of deal. There's often a lot more to something, but I don't know anything specific.
Thank you. Yeah, that was never taught in our history books. We never knew anything about the assassin, just where the bullet holes were.
Yeah, I was able to get to the Capitol where it actually happened. I had a friend that was in the legislature. That was kind of a fun experience.
Well, since the two of you have brought up the subject of Louisiana in the context with Louis Long, I want to remind or bring to the attention of some of our viewers and listeners who aren't familiar with the history of the Henry George movement, that it was around 1900 that people from up in the north managed to get some land on Mobile Bay in Alabama, moved south and established the utopian community of Fairhope, which was based in part on the idea of community land ownership and principles espoused by Henry George. And their founding document, the bylaws to organize Fairhope, were based on the principles they called cooperative individualism. And that's something that impressed me enormously. And I have come to believe that is the term that best describes principles of Henry George, cooperative individualism. So there's more about the Louisiana story that could be told as well.
Yeah. Oh, before we leave, Huey P. Long, he was running for president, and his Secretary of War or whatever, it was Smedley Butler, and I think anybody who knows who he was shows that Long was very much a Bryan type of anti-imperialist. But
he's the most decorated officer in the U.S. Army.
Yeah.
War is racket. He's known for that quote.
Yeah.
So have we reached the end of our discussion this evening?
Yeah. Smedley Butler was in the Marine Corps, not the Army.
Okay,
Yeah.
Sorry, Army, the Marine Corps. Sorry.
And am I correct in my remembrance that he was a supporter of the single tax or of land value taxation?
I never found that.
I have a memory about it, but I wouldn't be able to put my finger on the source for that memory, at least not right away.
I would be glad to know. Could be an additional decoration for him.
Well, so thanks everyone for attending and contributing. And next week we will pick it up with Theodore Roosevelt in the office of the presidency. And until then, have a good week. I'll see you next Monday.
Okay.
Thank you, Ed. Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everybody.